You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
When Barbara McCulkin woke up on the morning of Thursday, March 8th, 1973, she did the same thing she normally did. A creature of habit, she walked down to the corner store, just a few doors down from her home on Dorchester Street in Brisbane's Highgate Hill, to grab her morning newspaper. As she picked it up, she glanced at the front page, the headline declaring the deaths of 15 people, with pictures of the fire-gutted frontage of what used to be the Whisky Au Go Go nightclub in Fortitude Valley, which had gone up in flames earlier that morning. "Oh my God," she whispered to herself. They actually did it. Barbara McCulkin knew exactly who was responsible for making those headlines. Just weeks earlier, she'd overheard a conversation discussing that very event. And now, she was the keeper of a secret the police and the public were desperate to uncover. But holding on to a secret of that magnitude, a secret involving people who had no qualms about using violence to get what they wanted, meant what Barbara knew was about to make her a target. 10 months later, police would enter that home in Dorchester Street to find Barbara's purse still sitting on the fridge. The clothes that she was sewing for her daughter's return to school that year paused mid-seam on the sewing machine. The lives of Barbara's two young daughters, aged 13 and 11, were strewn about the home, clothes and toys piled up on surfaces, posters of Michael Jackson and Elton John adorning the walls, a teddy bear lying waiting for its person to come home. What they didn't find was Barbara McCulkin or her daughters Vicky and Leanne. The observations of two other little girls, friends and neighbours of Vicky and Leanne, would see two underworld figures brought into the spotlight for the McCulkin family disappearance. But it wouldn't be until decades later that we would finally find out what really happened to Barbara, Vicky and Leanne. I'm Claire Murphy, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. The notorious Whisky Au Go Go nightclub fire in Brisbane in 1973 left behind questions that remain unanswered to this day. Who was really behind it? Who was there that night? Why did 15 people have to die? And did it go beyond just criminal activity to include corrupt police too? But the deaths of 15 people that night wouldn't be the only ones linked to the blaze. When the McCulkins, 34-year-old Barbara, 13-year-old Vicky and 11-year-old Leanne went missing in 1974, the investigation into their disappearance would find very little. But a confession from another criminal many years later would send two men to jail and again cause the convictions around the Whisky Au Go Go fire to be questioned. Matthew Condon is a prize-winning Australian novelist and journalist whose most recent book, The Night Dragon, details the Whisky Au Go Go series of events. He's also the host of Ghostgate Road, a podcast that touches on some of the identities tied into the Whisky Au Go Go conspiracy. He joins us now. Just before you hear from Matt, please be aware that this episode of True Crime Conversations includes discussions around sexual assault. Listener discretion is advised. When Barbara met and married Billy McCulkin back in 1960, do you think all the way back then she was aware of his criminal tendencies all the way back in the beginning?
I'm not sure that Barbara was fully cognizant of Billy's background at the beginning. She was from a Maryborough, which is sort of northwest of Brisbane. a simple life, a happy girl with lots of brothers. As far as I can understand, this is a mystery in the story. I understand she first met Billy possibly when she was working in a cafe in downtown Maryborough when she was very young. I'm talking 16, 17. Billy McCulkin, of course, there's no beating around the bush about this. He was a thief, he was a thug, he was an alcoholic, and I'm not sure whether Barbara understood the full magnitude of what she was stepping into with him. He was connected, he was linked in with Vincent O'Dempsey and other criminals in that milieu in the Brisbane region, southeast Queensland in the 60s, but they grew to become very heavy gangsters.
So she moves with Billy away from Maryborough down into Brisbane, where they set up a house on Dorchester Street. They have 2 children. What kind of mum was Barbara? What kind of woman was she like as she's sort of growing and learning more and more about her husband?
By all accounts, and I've interviewed members of her family and her brother and others, she was a very good mother, very attentive to her 2 daughters, Vicky and Leanne. She did her best with very little. So we're talking about a woman who in the 60s had a husband who came and went and whose wage was itinerant depending on what he was getting up to in the nocturnal hours of his so-called career. She kept the ship steady with a job in the Brisbane CBD in a sandwich shop in Queen Street. By all accounts, she had or tried to establish a secret bank account, for want of a better word, so that Billy couldn't get his hands on her money. She was using that money to feed her children, to clothe them for school, to give them some form of a social life against enormous odds with Billy McCulkin. He was a philanderer, a punter, a drinker. So, she had genuine concerns about sustaining the family itself. They had a rental up on Dorchester Street in Highgate Hill, which for those who don't know is in South Brisbane, just across the river from Brisbane CBD. It wasn't much to call home, let me tell you. It was a little old Queenslander on stumps on a steep block. When I was researching my podcast about this and the Whisky Au Go Go, Ghostgate Road, I drove past 6 Dorchester Street hundreds of times because to me it's the sort of epicenter of the beginnings of this tragedy.
So while Billy was there with the family in Dorchester Street, it's reported that he would often have his criminal counterparts, his inner circle, often come to the house and spend time with him there. I imagine Barbara would have seen and overheard quite a lot during the conversations that would have been had in that little house.
Yes, she did. It was a very small house. It had, those thin VJ boards that are traditional in older Queenslanders. Billy was nocturnal, if you like. This was, part of his trade was to work at night with his so-called mates. He had a lot of them coming in and out. It was like a nightclub in a sense for the criminal associates of Billy McCulkin. That included Vincent O'Dempsey, Gary Dubois, John Andrew Stewart, and a host of others who would come and go. They would shoot the breeze, drink, play cards, plot, plan. And, for anyone familiar with that great American TV drama, The Sopranos, it's absolutely not far from the truth. These men would come together and work out, how are we going to earn a quid tomorrow? What's the plan for tomorrow? Where can we get some easy money? And they did live day by day, week by week, with petty scams and all manner of things. And, Barbara was an intrinsic part of that household. She held it together single-handedly. She had 2 young girls going to school. Try and imagine this. She was trying, on one hand, to balance a successful life as a mother, mothering her children and giving them the best she physically could. She would take them, for example, on the weekends to the roller skating rink across the river at Red Hill. So she tried to factor in enjoyment and moments of happiness for her kids. Simultaneously, there's a life going on in that house that it has everything to do with criminality, violence, theft, fraud. So to try and think of those 2 disparate lives coexisting. It's painful to think about.
So Barbara wakes up on the morning of March 8, 1973 and wanders down to the corner shop to grab her daily newspaper. What happens when she reads the headlines that morning?
So she goes down on that morning of March 8, which was a Thursday, and sees the morning headlines, and that was the firebombing at the Whisky Au Go Go, 15 people dead. And in that store, looking at the newspaper front page, she says, and this is overheard by the shopkeeper, "Oh my God, they actually did it." That comment, it opens a trapdoor. So as we were discussing with all the planning and the meetings and the people coming and going, she clearly, as indicated by that statement, if it's accurate, had foreknowledge of this string of fires that was happening in Brisbane in early 1973, culminating in the Whisky Au Go Go mass murder.
In the aftermath of that news breaking and in the sort of months after, did Barbara speak to anybody outside of her husband, who I understand was with another woman at this stage? Did she speak to anybody that would make those around Billy and his acquaintances feel like she would out them as being a part of the Whisky Au Go Go mass murder where 15 people were killed?
Yes, so if we look at the timeline and we focus right now on the marriage between Barbara and Billy, it's an incredibly interesting time. Things are happening in their private life and, bear some gravity on concerns about Barbara McCulkin and what she may or may not know. So what was happening in the lead up to March 8 was that Billy had been philandering, of course, and had hooked up with another woman. Barbara had essentially kicked him out of the house. He still had some clothing and personal effects at the home at Dorchester Street. But her marriage is suddenly falling apart at this very moment. And when the whiskey went up, Barbara, it appears, had some significant knowledge about, at the very least, her husband's potential involvement in that crime. There are a number of people she spoke to. There was a very close friend, a female friend of hers, and she alluded to the fact that she had significant knowledge potentially about what happened at the whiskey. There was a neighbour that she befriended, a young man. He was at 4 Dorchester Street, and they would convivially chat over the fence. Because of the proximity of these little workers' cottages in Dorchester Street, this young man, who was in a front room at the house right next to 6 Dorchester Street, had pretty much a sort of, grandstand view in terms of what he saw and what he heard of what was going on in 6 Dorchester Street. When the marriage between Barbara and Billy was breaking down, there were fights, there was, raised voices. And when Billy left, she would confide in this young man, essentially describing what was happening in her life. And she also directly said to him, Peter Nisbet, his name was, that she had enough knowledge on her husband's criminal activities to put him in jail for 30 years. So if, for example, you were a criminal associate of Billy McCulkin and indeed had anything to do with the Whisky Au Go Go, how would you view Barbara at that period? Here is a woman now newly single, living alone with 2 daughters. She's got no money, very little prospects, and word is getting around that she may be starting to talk about what she has learned in 6 Dorchester Street about this sequence of crimes that led to Australia's then biggest mass murder. So is she potentially a significant liability? Yes, she is.
Who were the people who were starting to get nervous, aside from Billy, about what potentially Barbara could start to talk about?
Well, what you're asking is one of the enduring mysteries of the Whisky Au Go Go, for example, that we've discussed. So who would be worried about Barbara blowing the lid on at least the immediate involvement of Billy McCulkin, potentially Vincent O'Dempsey, potentially Tommy Hamilton, John Andrew Stewart, and James Finch, let's make the assumption that there is a higher strata of organised crime that in fact was involved in the Whisky Au Go Go, that the Billy McCulkins of the world were on the middle rung of this organised attack. Who was higher up the ladder that was overseeing not just the orchestration of the firebombing, which went terribly wrong and left 15 people dead, but who was then overseeing shutting down people who knew too much? We don't know. We can only make assumptions about who that might be. Clearly, however, whoever made the decision, a decision was made, which we'll elaborate on, but a decision was made about Barbara McCulkin, what she knew, and how seriously that might impact upon the commission, in essence, of 15 murders. So you're looking at the greatest crime one could commit is to take another human life, multiply that by 15, and watch the rats flee the ship. I mean, this is a very, very serious crime. And if they have to cut off any avenue that may be dangerous and may lead to arrests, then they'd have to go ahead and do that.
So Barbara's walking around with this knowledge, and she's making it clear to at least some people around her that she might be willing to talk and maybe ruin some of those lives that we're talking about. And so in January 1974, 10 months after the Whisky Au Go Go fire, some of those in Billy McCulkin's inner circle stop by and visit Barbara. What happened on that day, January 16, 1974?
Okay, it's a very, very significant date. And if we put it into context, this was literally a week before the great 1974 Brisbane floods, the cyclone that came bearing down from the north, record levels of flooding just a week after the 16th. And that's important for another reason, which we'll talk about. So on the 16th, in Dorchester Street, there was a little friend of Vicky and Leanne's across the road, and she was having a birthday party. And, very exciting for these young girls. They're still on school holidays, about to go back to school at the end of January. And the birthday party is arranged for that night, and they're excited. There's going to be cake and candles and all of that sort of thing. Now, Vicky and Leanne go across the road to the party, and an orange Valiant Charger parks just slightly down the road from 6 Dorchester Street, but within sight of the house. And it's Vincent O'Dempsey and his sidekick, Gary Dubois, who have dropped by to say hello to Barbara. Now, witnesses saw Gary Dubois carrying a half carton of long neck beers with him into the house. I mean, that's interesting because Vince O'Dempsey was a teetotaler. He didn't drink. But Gary was seen carrying that into the house, and the car was there for some time. Vicky felt ill, came home, I think, mid-evening, and ultimately Leanne skipped across the road as well after the party. Now, what happened from that point is sketchy might be the wrong word, but there was the proposition, certainly in court cases decades into the future, that there was an offer from Vincent O'Dempsey to take Barbara and the girls on a little drive in the car.
Can we establish that that type of car was like incredibly popular at the time, right?
I'm ashamed to say I'm old enough to remember the advertising promotion for that vehicle. In the ads, whenever anyone saw this incredibly souped up racing car, they would go, "Hey, Charger," and hold their hands up in a V sign, V for Valiant. And an incredibly popular campaign, especially with children. It was a 2-door, very souped up vehicle, very powerful vehicle. And when you think about the concept of going for a drive, so it was a 2-door, you had to fold back the passenger or driver's seat in order to let your passengers into the rear seat. So there would have only been space And it would have been a squeeze for Barbara and the two girls in the back, and then you've got Vincent O'Dempsey as the driver. He owned that vehicle, and Shorty in the front. So, it's not exactly the sort of car you would go for a leisurely sightseeing tour. These three women are crammed into the back space. I mean, I just find it incongruous that, given it was late at night, given in the lead up to the great floods the following week, it was probably raining. I'm just wondering if there wasn't more pressure put to bear on Barbara than we know to get her into that vehicle. I mean, if she had felt there was any threat to her children, I have no doubt she would have fought with her life to protect those kids. So somehow they were cajoled into getting into the back of that car. And that was quite literally the last time anybody saw Barbara and her two daughters.
Who reported them missing to police, and how long after that night did that happen?
So Billy was no longer living at home. He was with a new girlfriend across the other side of the city. He was working at the time as what they called a dogman on a building site at 444 Queen Street in the city. A dogman is an individual who assists with the operation of cranes and chains and all of that sort of stuff. And he had told Barbara early in the week that he was going to pop by on that night, the night they disappeared. What did he do? He went across the road to the National Hotel and other of his favourite pubs, the Port Office Hotel, got drunk, never made it. So we're now entering the next day, which is a Friday. He goes to work and goes over to the house after work. What he finds is the front door locked, no Barbara or the children. He claims that he smashed a window pane on the door in order to get in. He claims that when he went in, he found the girls' pet kittens locked in the laundry. There were photographs of the inside of the house taken by police, were tended to the trial of Vince O'Dempsey in decades forward in time. The house is frozen in time in those photographs. So what you see in the lounge room, for example, is an old sewing machine set up with a dress still under the needle. Barbara was making clothing for her daughters. The light of the sewing machine was still switched on. It just looked like Barbara had pushed the chair back while she was sewing, pushed the chair back, and it was just left exactly as it was. It is quite literally frozen in the moment Barbara and the girls left 6 Dorchester Street. Billy reportedly was panicking. He ran into one of the little girls from across the road, the ones that had had the party. Billy asked that child, "Have you seen Barbara and the girls?" And she said that she hadn't seen them since the 16th. Billy said, "Was anyone at the house?" And the little girl said, "Yes, Vince and Shorty Dubois." She had been introduced to them by Vicky and Leanne, to Vince and Shorty. And 2 days later, when Billy asked her, she says, yes, a man called Vince and Shorty were at the house that night. This enrages McCulkin. He alleges he doesn't drive, so he was catching cabs and catching buses, and he eventually had to ask for the assistance of a friend to drive him around all of these places in Brisbane he thought Barbara might be. And that happened. But the thought of O'Dempsey and Dubois being at the house, it's impossible to tell whether Billy McCulkin was lying, was being genuine in these police statements he initially made about the disappearance of his wife and girls. I think he knew a lot more than he let on. He was playing the grieving husband and the grieving father. It just doesn't ring true to me, the statements he made to the police. But so what happens, unfortunately, is that Billy allegedly goes to the police at South Brisbane and says, look, my wife and daughters are missing. It's not taken seriously. Then, of course, the following week, you have these epic Brisbane floods, which swept across the city. People died. It was an historic moment. By the time all of that had receded, that natural disaster, the story of Barbara, Vicky, and Leanne had been swept away with the floodwaters, pretty much. No one was interested. It wasn't in the newspapers. And it wasn't until several weeks later that there was a report in the Courier Mail about this missing mother and her 2 children. Now, by now, the distance between January 16 and the actual event was 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks beyond when it happened. So every day that passes is a disaster for a proper investigation, let alone every week. Now, when I was researching this story, I interviewed a police officer who was not on the initial investigation but was summoned to reinvestigate the McCulkin disappearances in the late 1970s. And he told me this. The first thing he did, of course, which is natural enough, is to go and grab the McCulkin missing persons file out of the files, which he did. In the folder, he found, I think, 2 A4 sheets of paper. Nothing had been done. And he found the rolls of film of a police photographer that had gone in at some point and taken photographs of the scene. And they're the photographs I described to you earlier about the sewing machine and the girls' bedrooms. And those films had not even been developed. So you were talking about a crime in 1974. You're talking about a triple murder. Go forward for 5 years and a police officer retrieves from the file crime scene photos that they hadn't even bothered to develop them yet. So you have to ask the question, why was less than nothing done to investigate the disappearance of a young mother in her early 30s and 2 children, given her association by marriage with known criminals and offenders? Why was nothing ever done? And that goes to the heart of this tragic tale.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Claire Murphy. I'm speaking with novelist and journalist Matthew Condon about the murder of the McCulkins, Barbara, Vicky and Leanne. Do we start to draw conclusions there like we have with the Whisky Au Go Go fire, where there's always been a suggestion that there's been corrupt police involved in the fire itself? Could we also draw a conclusion that the police who were maybe involved in the Whisky Au Go Go fire also don't want to draw extra attention to it, and by investigating Barbara's disappearance, perhaps that would do that?
I don't think there's any doubt, and I think with the benefit of now of significant hindsight, you can see that anyone who tried to unpick the McCulkin disappearances would suddenly be lifting the lid on the Whisky Au Go Go tragedy. There is no question about that. So what is a tried and true way to prevent that from happening? It's a go slow tactic, as in do nothing. As this officer I interviewed discovered firsthand when he went to reinvestigate. So let the dust settle. The passage of time will take care of things. And most certainly for decades that worked with the McCulkin case.
What did that officer find in that second investigation? Did anything come of it?
He worked very diligently with his police detective partner, Trevor Maneri. They did an extraordinary job. They went and re-interviewed people, collated fresh statements. This officer was convinced that somehow O'Dempsey and Dubois were involved in what now looked most certainly like a triple murder. And in late 1979, thanks to the work of these officers, Vince O'Dempsey and Gary Dubois were indeed arrested and charged with the murder of Barbara McCulkin and Vicky and Leanne McCulkin. Now, when that finally got to court in 1980, the Crown prosecutor of the day made a decision that there was not enough evidence to move forward with a successful prosecution. So those charges were laid aside and O'Dempsey and Dubois were free to go. You might look on that decision with horror, and there is every reason to be skeptical and to eye that decision with great suspicion. Now, by accident or design, who knows? But if those men had been charged with the McCulkin murders and found not guilty, under the double jeopardy rule, they could never have been tried on that offence again. So, given the charges were laid aside, that meant in theory, and most certainly legally, that who knows in the future, if ever enough evidence was collated, those men could legitimately be charged again with that offence. And that's the way it transpired.
Well, let's find out how that actually happened, because we're talking decades later. Vince and Gary Dubois have gone off and had their own twisted lives, still doing what criminals do. What actually led them back to court?
It's a very good question. In 2014, and we're talking now about the 40th anniversary of the disappearance of Barbara and the girls, the Queensland Police Cold Case Homicide Squad made a decision to reinvestigate the case. And one of those officers, an incredible detective by the name of Virginia Gray, was put on this case, and they've essentially started from scratch. Now, theoretically, if you stand back and look at that decision 40 years after this alleged triple murder, you would wonder what would there be left to knit together. The passage of time is extraordinary. People had died, witnesses had passed away. And then you'd have to factor in who would talk to you. Even some of the players or the characters in this incredible drama say they were in their 30s when these crimes were perpetrated. They're now in their 70s.
Well, even Billy McCulkin had passed away by then, hadn't he?
Yes, he had. So Billy McCulkin had passed away as well. So hats off to the police, Mick Dowie and Virginia Gray. They did an unbelievable job. So they also managed to do something that prior investigators had not managed to do, and this was the key to the success of this reinvestigation and prosecution. And that was that Dowie and Gray managed to get two primary people. One was Peter Hall, who was formerly a member of the Clockwork Orange gang in Brisbane and a good friend of Gary Dubois and others, and Warren McDonald, who was essentially Vince O'Dempsey's apprentice in the making, if you like, in the 90s and onward. The investigators managed to get them to become Crown witnesses in this. They turned over, and I feel with extraordinary bravery stood up against that code of silence, and they broke it. The extraordinary thing is that Peter Hall has been a successful businessman in his own right in New South Wales and nurtured a family and turned his life around a long time ago. And the same with Warren McDonald. He is an extraordinary character, an incredible character. And he himself has become a very successful businessman in Southeast Queensland as well. So it was those two critical witnesses that turned the case around in this instance.
Can you talk us through what Peter Hall told police that Gary Dubois had admitted to him about what happened on that day in January 1974?
He lived in Brisbane. I'm not sure whether your listeners are familiar overly with the so-called Clockwork Orange gang, but this was a group of criminals. Many of them met in prison in Brisbane during the 60s, and in the 70s came together. And let's be honest, the bulk of their crimes it was petty stuff. For example, Peter Hall tells the story of they would be cruising around Brisbane and they would see a delivery truck outside a store, and the delivery driver was taking some gear inside the shop, will have left his truck open at the back, They seized the opportunity, came in, nicked some stuff out the back, and off they went. So it was just opportunistic moments where they would commit these crimes. They did a lot of break and enters. Essentially, that's how in those early days they earned their money. And Peter Hall was a part of that group. If you're trying to compare them on the scale of, for example, groups or gangs in Sydney, they were like kids playing marbles compared to the big guys in Sydney. But in terms of Brisbane, they were a homegrown criminal group. They worked as a pack and did a lot of mischievous stuff. So Peter was a part of that. And as I said, he was in Brisbane. They all sort of lived variously in rentals together and were flatmates and all of that sort of stuff. At one point, they had a hearse that they bought, and they would drive the hearse around Brisbane and get up to all sorts of shenanigans. But on the 16th of January, Shorty went missing after that night of the 16th. And the timeline varies, but didn't come back for between 24 and 48 hours. He returned to his mother's house in Brisbane. Now, this is a very tight group of men who know what each other is doing almost at every point. They're organising jobs at night time, cruising around suburbs, breaking, entering. They're working in pairs, working in threes, so they know each other's schedule. Suddenly, Shorty vanished for 24 to 48 hours. Peter Hall couldn't make sense of it, and then emerged back in Brisbane. As Peter Hall described it, that he looked like a different person. The look on his face, the colour, the pallor of his skin. Peter instantly knew something of great magnitude had happened and was affecting Shorty. Now, soon after, Shorty had a confidential conversation with Peter Hall and essentially said that he and Vince had taken Barbara and the girls in that vehicle that night, that they'd driven from Brisbane to a township southwest of Brisbane called Warwick. Warwick was the hometown of Vincent O'Dempsey. And essentially, Shorty said that they'd taken Barbara and the girls into the bush and basically murdered Barbara and the girls. Shorty blamed Vince and said, I didn't want to do it, but it was Vince, he led the charge and killed all three of them, essentially. This was weighing clearly, according to Peter Hall, very heavily on Shorty Dubois, a terrible, terrible thing that he allegedly witnessed. And, in many ways, that's where the secret was kept for 40 plus years until Peter Hall finally decided to reveal that conversation with his good friend way back in 1974.
So it's this confession, along with other testimony, that finally puts Vincent O'Dempsey and Gary Shorty Dubois behind bars. But we still don't know where Barbara and the girls' remains are. Do we have any idea where their final resting place is?
If only we knew for the family. But one of the stories that Shorty told Peter as well was that in the bushland they had the party, as in Vince, Shorty, Barbara and the children, had crossed a creek or a watercourse. There appeared to be willow trees in the vicinity, that they'd then gone up a track, like a rise for maybe 500 to 700 meters, and that they stopped and Barbara was raped, as were the girls, and they were murdered. Shorty further told Peter Hall, he said the most horrific sight, he told Peter Hall, was when the sun came up and the bodies were there, and effectively said they had buried the bodies. So, this could be anywhere, and I myself have looked with the assistance of locals in Warwick, and there are people, I can tell you, to this day in the Warwick region still trying to piece together that limited bit of information about the creek, the willows, the rise through the bush, trying to approximate where it could possibly be. Now, there was an interesting piece of information that came out about a sighting of the orange charger on the morning of the 17th of January at Warwick. and that the car had been parked behind the Glengallen historic mansion outside of Warwick. It's now a restored homestead. At the time of the murders of 1974, it was in rack and ruin, and in fact had been used for decades by local teenagers to go and take alcohol and have a party in the house and in this ramshackle house. And in fact, I received information from people that Vince O'Dempsey, as a teenager, had gone there many times. So the sighting from a local dairy farmer was that he believed he saw the Charger parked behind the Glengallen house that morning, and then later in the day it was gone. So we're not able to work with much. It's only what Shorty told Peter Hall all those years ago, with minimal clues and information. The creek, the willows, etc. It's really has never been enough to go on. Police, of course, have never found the remains. And the only people, obviously, that know specifically were Shorty Dubois and Vincent O'Dempsey. Queensland was a relatively early adopter of no bodies, no parole legislation. So Vincent O'Dempsey has zero chance of parole without giving up where those bodies are located. Stories came to me through the years of the fact that, and this is distasteful, but perhaps the bodies were destroyed by fire and the ashes disseminated across a wide area. There was also O'Dempsey's peculiar attraction to acid. This is evidence from friends and associates of his through the years. So, unfortunately, I don't think they'll ever be found.
Have Vincent O'Dempsey or Gary Dubois said anything after being convicted, after the search for these remains continues? Have they ever spoken out about any aspect of their involvement in the disappearance and murder of Barbara and her daughters, Vicky and Leanne?
Yes, with Vincent O'Dempsey, whose saying since he was a young crook was loose lips sink ships. So he's ordinarily never spoken, but he has spoken on 2 occasions, albeit minimally. At the most recent inquest into the Whisky Au Go Go, he again denied any involvement in the murder of Barbara, Vicky and Leanne McCulkin. Most significantly, on the day of his sentencing for the conviction of the murder of Barbara and the girls, which was 2017, on his sentencing day, and I was sitting there in the court behind the glass dock with him and Dubois in the dock, O'Dempsey's lawyer stood and addressed Justice Peter Applegarth and said, "Your Honour, my client would like to say something." And everyone was like, "You've got to be joking." Not only was it odd, given it was during the sentencing hearing, not during the trial, not during any previous court matters. He'd been found guilty by a jury of his peers of a triple murder. Some time had elapsed to the sentencing hearing, and he decides at the sentencing hearing, when he's in fact a convicted murderer, that he wanted to profess his innocence. So he stood, I saw it in his hand, he had written some notes on what looked to me like an Aldi supermarket brochure that had fallen out of a newspaper. And he jotted notes in the little margins of this piece of paper. And he essentially stood and predictably said, "I didn't murder Barbara and the girls. I had no reason to murder them whatsoever. And also I had nothing to do with the Whisky Au Go Go." Now, this stopped the court dead in its tracks because, in essence, no one had asked him about the Whisky Au Go Go. So here he was denying any involvement whatsoever when, in fact, he wasn't asked. Now, Peter Applegarth decided to challenge O'Dempsey on this point. With transcripts and binders and folders in front of him, Justice Applegarth, and I'm paraphrasing him, essentially said, "Well, according to the evidence before me, I beg to differ on that point that you've just made about the Whisky Au Go Go, because there was plenty of material that I have that I did not allow into the murder trial for it to remain fair for you, a fair trial. But now that you're convicted, I can mention this. He said, to my mind, there is enough evidence to indicate that you did have a part in the Whisky Au Go Go firebombing. Now, that triggered the government. The next morning, the government announced the new inquest into the whiskey, but it was only because Dempsey stood and spoke, something he's never done, and perhaps there's a very good reason he's never done it, because look what happened when he stood at his sentencing hearing. It triggered an entire new investigation into the Whisky Au Go Go.
Thanks to Matthew for helping us understand more about the Whisky Au Go Go tragedy and the links between it and the deaths of Barbara, Vicky and Leanne. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by myself, Claire Murphy. Our executive producer is Gia Moylan, with assistant production by Tali Blackman. Our audio design is by Scott Stronach. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.